All right, so we're on question 6. Now with question 6, we start dealing with quadrants. We were okay with this. Some of us still made a couple of mistakes here. I just want to make sure that we're going to be all right with this. This is location. Which quadrant is the, in which quadrant theta terminates in? So you just have to remember ASTC and just kind of see which situation is satisfied twice. In the first example, it says the sign is a negative 1/2. I'm not even interested in the fact that it's a half. I'm interested that it's negative. Quadrants that the sign is negative in is in quadrant 3 and in quadrant 4. So I put checks there. Cosine is positive. The only two quadrants cosine is positive in is quadrant 1 and quadrant 4. So the one quadrant that satisfies both conditions is quadrant 4. So that's my answer. In question number 7, again, ASTC. It says that the cosine is a negative. Well, the only place the cosine could be a negative in is quadrant 2 and 3. But it says tangent of theta is equal to 1. That's a positive number. The only place tangent's positive in is in quadrant 1 and 3. So overall, we need to be in quadrant 3 for those two facts to be true. And the last one, with this type of question, it says cosine is negative. Cosine's less than 0. That means it's negative. That means we're in quadrants either 2 or 3. But it tells me cosine's negative. I'm multiplying that by sine to get something that's greater than 0. That means it's got to turn out to be positive. That means the sign has to also be negative. And in what quadrants is the sign negative? 3 and 4. So we have to be in quadrant 3. Okay? Now this is where we all kind of lost some things. Sine of 330. It's greater than 90. We have to come up with a reference angle. So we have to figure out where it is. So 330 degrees puts me in quadrant 4. How far from the x-axis? 30 degrees. So this is going to be rewritten as a sine of 30. However, I'm in quadrant 4. This is what some of you did not consider. I'm in quadrant 4. Quadrant 4 is the cosine quadrant. So what's the sign in that quadrant? Negative. Okay? So now I'm looking for the negative sine 30. So I go to my triangles. Right? Here's 30. Sine of 30, opposite over hypotenuse. I get 1/2. So negative sine of 30 is simply just going to be negative 1/2. A lot of you got 1/2. I had to take a point off because you didn't come up with the correct sign. You have to know where you are. Tan 120. Tan 120, that puts me in quadrant 2. How far from the x-axis? This becomes 60 degrees. But if I'm in the second quadrant, that's the quadrant where the sine's positive. What's the tangent? Negative. Once you get that down, then you go to your triangles. Same triangles before. This time I want the tangent of 60. Here's 60, tangent, opposite over adjacent. Opposite over adjacent. That's the square root of 3 over 1. So come back to my paper. So negative tan 60 is going to be negative the square root of 3 over 1, which is just negative the square root of 3. All right. For the next one, I have radian measure. Let's change it to degree. All right. And again, we talked about how we can do this a couple times, but I'm just going to look at, I can multiply it by 180 over pi, or I can remember that pi, it represents how many degrees? It's going to represent 180. And we're going to be looking for either a 30, 45, or 60 triangle. So if I take 180 and divide it by 3, which one of those do I get? 60. What's 5 times 60? 300. So now it's 300 degrees. That puts me in quadrant 4. How far from the x-axis? 60 degrees. So this is cosine of 60. What's the cosine in quadrant 4? Positive. That's the quadrant where the cosine's positive. So once I have that all changed with its sign, now I go to the cosine of 60. So here I am. What does the cosine mean? Opposite over, adjacent over hypotenuse. So cosine is adjacent over hypotenuse, so we're going to be dealing with a positive 1/2. Right? Move down now to number 12. All right, sine squared. Hey, well, if you see a number in front, like the 4 here, or you see sine squared, don't panic on that. We have to know what to square before we can square. What to square is this in here. I can rewrite this way. It means the same thing. Okay? That means, and you can see if I wrote it that way, evaluate and then square. But we don't have to write it with all those parentheses. We can just throw the square up here. So what I'm interested in is, before I do the square, I'm interested in just the sine of whatever 3 pi over 2 is. Well, let's start. What's pi over 2? If pi is 180, what's pi over 2? 90. What's 3 times 90? Yeah, so this becomes the sine of 270. Where do I go to find out what the sine of 270 is? Yeah, I'm going to go to the unit circle, which is here. I'm going to go 270 degrees. That puts me right here, right at this point. And which coordinate is the sine? The y coordinate. So it's going to be a -1. So I come back to my paper. So the sine of 270 becomes, and this is now squared, this becomes -1 squared, which is 1. Second. Yep. All right, show me. 4 tan 135. 4 tan 135. Again, we want to try to find reference angle, so I'm going to go 135 first. That puts me in quadrant 2. How far from the x-axis? 45 degrees. So this becomes 4 tan of 45. But what's, and this is what we forgot to do, what's the tangent in the second quadrant? Negative. We have to put that negative on it. When I go to the triangles, I go to my 45, 45, 90. I want the tan of 45. What's opposite over adjacent with that triangle? 1. So this is just going to become 4 times a -1, which is a -4. All right, last question I'm going to do on this paper, because I didn't have a lot of room there. So I have 8 sine squared 7 pi over 6 minus 5 sine 270. All right, so again, we'll start here. 8 sine squared. I can't square anything until I know what's going on. I need to know what this angle is. So let's go pi over 6, 180 divided by 6, 30, 30 times 7. Or 30 times 7, 210, minus 5 times sine 270. So I'm not even going to evaluate yet. All right, the 270 I'm not going to have to worry about changing because it's a quadrantal. It lands right on one of the axes. We'll talk about that one in a second. Sine of 210, 210 degrees. It puts me in quadrant 3. How far from the x-axis? 30, right? So it's going to be, and actually what I'm going to do is write it this way now. It's sine of 30, and all of this is going to be squared because we've got to do that sine squared business. But I'm in quadrant 3. If I'm in quadrant 3, what's the sine? Yeah, you're in the tangent quadrant, so this is negative. All right, minus 5 times. Well, let's go ahead and see what the sine of 270 is again. I go back to my unit circle. Yep, my unit circle. I'm down here. It's going to be -1. So this is 5 times -1. -5 times -1 is a +6. All right, so that piece is done. Sine of 30. What do we think? Oh my God. Sorry, +5. Whew, okay. Thank you. Sine of 30. 1 over 2. Good. So sine of 30 is 1/2. But it's negative, so this becomes 8 times a -1/2, but the -1/2 is being squared. How do you do this? What do we do first? We square the 1/2. First of all, when you square a negative, what happens? It's going to be positive, so this becomes 8 times 1 squared over 2 squared. So what's 1 times, or 1/4 times 8? 2. Answer? 7. All right, and then the last two. The last two were, if I give you the fact that this is what I'm giving you. Cosine of theta is equal to negative 4/5. Cosine of theta is equal to negative 4/5, and I wanted you to find out what the tangent of theta was, and I wanted you to find out what the sine of theta was. And when we talked about a question like this, we said, make a triangle. Make a triangle and make this part true. So I'm going to make a right triangle. I'm going to label this angle here theta. Oops. Theta. And then from that angle, I'm going to make the fact that the cosine of that theta is 4/5. So that means the adjacent side must be 4, and the hypotenuse must be 5. Now, nope, you can't have a negative 4 as a side. So where does the negative come from? Yeah. Right now, they also tell me in the problem that the angle is in quadrant 3. That's why the cosine has to be negative, because that's the tangent quadrant. So if I have a 4 and a 5, what does this side have to be? 3. So it's a 3, 4, 5 right triangle. So knowing that it's a 3, 4, 5 right triangle, to be able to answer this using tangent now, tangent is going to be opposite over adjacent, so 3 over 4. And I'm in quadrant 3, which means the tangent's what? Positive. So it's a positive 3 over 4. Part B, the sine, 3 over 5. The sine's going to be 3 over 5, and I'm in quadrant 3, so it's negative. All right, that was